If you want to be an effective leader, you need to understand your leadership style. To help you with that, I'm going to go over 6 different leadership styles to help you understand how you lead. The first leadership style, and probably the most maligned of the 6, is the autocratic leadership style. Autocratic leaders primarily tend to prefer flying solo and making decisions on their own or with a small team. In a lot of ways, autocratic leaders operate similarly to the military command structure, where input from the rank and file troops isn't necessarily solicited or encouraged. Now, this leadership style is sometimes necessary in an organization that's subject to strict regulatory guidelines or where the team is lacking in experience. The main issue with autocratic leadership is that your team is eventually likely to start resenting you in much the same way that military members tend to resent their command structure, especially on the officer side. Additionally, autocratic leadership tends to create an environment where the creative process is stifled. Because the team doesn't have any input, they can't contribute to creative problem solving as much. Now, if you're willing and able to balance these factors, autocratic leadership can lead to high productivity. And this is because instructions are often very clearly dictated, and employees don't feel as stressed out because the weight of the world isn't on their shoulders. If they don't succeed, it's usually because the instructions they were given weren't that good, and not so much because their creative abilities failed the team. As an autocratic leader, though, you have to be careful about your stress level because you do shoulder all of those burdens and accept responsibility for the failure of the mission. Leadership style number 2 is laissez faire. We've all heard this as probably one of the very few French terms that you know, and it's the complete opposite end of the spectrum from autocratic leadership. Laissez-faire leaders are going to tend to delegate tasks to their team and allow them to accomplish the task as they see fit, which allows them as the leader to focus on other aspects of the business, the mission, whatever. Think of a tenured college professor telling his class to write a 10-page paper on a chapter of a textbook. They might not provide any level of instruction beyond that and end up with 26 wildly different approaches, from comparison and contrast essays to depressing existential deep dives into the futility of the subject matter. This type of leadership works best with a highly experienced team that doesn't require much oversight so long as your expectations are still clearly communicated. If they know what the end goal is supposed to look like, they can usually get it done. So think maybe more along the lines of write a 10-page paper comparing and contrasting Roman and Saxon societal structure, rather than write a 10-page paper about European society. If they know what they're doing, they're going to get it done, but if their end result has to fit within certain parameters, those parameters need to be established. If your team isn't experienced, though, laissez-faire leadership is going to tend to lead to an unmotivated and confused work environment. And it can also paint a picture that you as a leader don't care about the outcome, which can lead to some real problems. Done right, though, this style encourages creative problem solving and encourages a relaxed work environment, as well as enhanced personal accountability and ownership of the end result. So style number 3 is democratic leadership. Now, democratic is sort of the leadership buzzword, and it's basically just autocratic and laissez-faire had a baby. So while the leader is still going to maintain control of the project overall, they're going to solicit input from their team members. So think of a manager talking to his team before implementing a new schedule. If he just moves them from a 40-hour work week to a 72-hour work week, they're likely not going to be happy about that. And if he made that decision in a vacuum without consulting them, he'd probably be transitioning from a manager to a hiring manager because he's going to have to replace his entire team. But by engaging in democratic leadership, he might realize that this isn't the best plan for his team. The downside to democratic leadership is that it can be fairly inefficient when you have to solicit this input from your team and collate those results and incorporate them into an actual decision. It can also lead to dissenting individuals feeling pressured to go with the will of the group and becoming unhappy in their work environment. Aside from that, though, democratic leadership can make individual employees feel empowered and valued while still allowing the leader to maintain some level of control. It also takes some of the burden of command off the leader and helps to keep their stress level down. Style number 4, servant leadership. Servant leaders focus on providing a positive and fulfilling environment for their teams rather than the actual outcome. Once the team knows what has to be done, a servant leader is going to focus on providing them the tools that they need to succeed both in and outside the work environment. By providing for their team, a servant leader assures that they'll still continue to be productive. Google's always been a really good example of this because they have a large amount of quality of life features both in and around their offices, as well as a lot of programs for their employees. Now, I can't say for sure if that's the reason that they're one of the most powerful entities on the planet, but it probably didn't hurt. The biggest drawback to servant leadership is often on the part of the leader themselves. Servant leaders tend to burn out easily and often as a side effect of putting others' needs before their own. Additionally, a servant leader might find it difficult to be assertive in a disciplinary situation. With that being said though, servant leaders do tend to boost productivity and morale while building a more well-rounded team and future leaders. Style number 5, transformational leadership. Transformational leaders excel in driving positive change for their people in support of their objective. I tend to look at transformational leaders as motivational leaders, but like actually sincere. They seek to impart their passion for their organization into their teams and get them fired up about their jobs. Speaking of jobs, probably the most famous example of a transformational leader is Steve Jobs. He was well known for inspiring the people that worked under him to think outside the box and find new solutions to problems even when they thought they couldn't go any further. Which I find really interesting because the last 5 iPhones, I couldn't tell you the difference between them if you put them in front of me. But we can't really blame Steve for that. A major trap of transformational leadership is hyper-focusing on motivating and developing your teams and losing sight of the actual objective that you're moving them towards. And additionally, not all organizations really lend themselves to transformational leadership. And if you do it wrong, it can become extremely cringeworthy. So for instance, if I worked as an assembly plant operator making those little paper cups at the water cooler, I would probably be a little bit annoyed if a transformational leader came along to get me fired up and motivated to make little paper cups. Now, if you are in a position where transformational leadership makes sense, it can create a self-sustaining and high-retention workplace full of people who have genuine passion for their jobs. So style number 6, right? 6, yeah. Transactional leadership. Transactional leaders view leadership as, well, a transaction. If you perform well, you get rewarded, and if you perform poorly, you get punished. Either way, the team provides the leader some sort of an input, and the leader responds accordingly. Transactional leaders rely on incentive programs, such as monetary bonuses or employee recognition, as well as negative feedback like paperwork, docked pay, or even termination. A good example of transactional leadership is multi-level marketing or pyramid schemes. Now, I don't mean good like they're good, but they're a good example. These MLM programs rely heavily on incentives for their salespeople, so free product, free cars, Mary Kay. There's very little actual interaction with the company outside of these incentivized interactions. So hey, I sold X amount of Scentsy, please send me a keychain. And to be fair, these incentivized campaigns work. Just scroll through your Facebook, you're gonna see 5 people that you went to high school with that are now a Scentsy consultant. Now there are definitely a few downsides to transactional leadership, probably the biggest of which being that incentive programs focus on short-term goals and not long-term development. And typically these programs don't heavily reward creativity and instead focus on output, which can lead to stagnation in innovation. Now this style of leadership does work really well in environments where motivation and innovation aren't really that big of a factor. So for instance, my paper cup factory analogy from earlier. It's going to be pretty hard to make somebody passionate about making paper cups, but it's not hard to make a worker passionate about bonus pay. A lot of major companies rely heavily on transactional leadership because it's easier to get people fired up with incentive programs than it is with an actual passion for what your company does in a lot of cases. So that's all I've got for you today, leaders. I hope that I've provided you at least a good starting point for diagnosing your leadership style. And if I provided you some value, be sure to hit that like button and leave a comment so we can have a conversation. And if you enjoyed this video and it did provide some value to you, please consider subscribing. It's one click for you, but it means a lot to my channel. I've got a lot of good stuff coming and I'm really excited to bring you guys some more No Bull leadership.